This is Beyond the Business.
Are we even using energy for the right reasons? When we talk about energy, we usually argue about sources oil or renewables, fossil or green, clean or dirty. But there is a much quieter question that almost nobody asks. Are we actually using energy, or we are mostly just keeping systems permanently switched on? Because those are not the same thing. There is energy that is genuinely necessary. Hospitals, court transport, essential logistics, communication, safety, basic living conditions. This energy has a clear purpose. There is an action, a result, and a benefit. But there is another category that is far larger and far less visible. Energy spent not for outcomes, but for readiness, for waiting, for availability, for just in case. Ships running while standing still, vehicles idling while waiting for demand, lights burning with no one around, systems operating on standby because stopping feels risky, and infrastructure consuming power even when nothing is happening. This is not overconsumption in the classic sense. It's not access driven by greed or growth. It's misuse. Energy without an event, energy without a user, energy without a result. And the system produces emissions but no real value. We have quietly moved from using energy for something to using energy to preserve the option of doing something. And options don't have limits. Readiness has no natural stopping point. Availability doesn't know when to rest. Standby has no definition of enough. So energy keeps flowing even when purpose disappears. This is where the human factor becomes central. Because this behavior isn't driven by machines, it's driven by expectations. We expect instant response, zero delay, permanent convenience, and no waiting. And the system was redesigned to meet that expectations. Not optimized for necessity, but optimized for immediacy. The irony is brutal. We talk about efficiency, but we accept massive inefficiency as long as it feels smooth. We talk about emissions, but ignore the biggest source of silent waste energy spent without use. We talk about responsibility, but outsource it to infrastructure that runs whether we need it or not. The final result is even stranger. The product of energy use is often no longer benefit, it is simply emissions. The action happens, the footprint remains, the purpose is questionable. This is not about shutting systems down, and it's not about moralizing everyday life. It's about asking a much more uncomfortable question. How much of our energy use exists only because the system is afraid to pause? Because if a large share of emissions comes not from doing necessary things, but from keeping everything permanently ready, then the problem isn't technology. It's behavior, expectation, and design. We believe in an energy system that doesn't know the difference between using and waiting. And until we learn to separate the two, no fuel switch will solve the problem. Because the most expensive energy is the energy that produces nothing except consequences. Almost everyone has seen that image the Earth from space at night. Dark continents cut through by rivers of light, cities glowing, networks illuminated, civilizations visible from orbit. It's a powerful image. It looks like progress, like life, like activity. But now pause for the moment and ask a different question. How much energy is being burned on the planet while most of the world is asleep? Not energy used for action, not energy producing movement, work, or outcomes. Just energy keeping things lit. Streets with no pedestrians, offices with no people, industrial zones in standby mode, infrastructure glowing simply because it always has. This is not an argument against safety or security. Light matters, visibility matters. Some systems must stay on. But the uncomfortable truth is this: constant illumination became the default not because it's optimal, but because it's easy. Once the lamps are installed, nobody asks again. Once the system is built, it keeps running, not because it's necessary, but because changing it requires attention. We don't design lightning around presence, we designed it around habit. And habit has no off switch. We could use motion sensors, we could adapt intensity, we could link energy use to real activity instead of permanent readiness. The technology already exists, the engineering problem is solved. What's missing is not capability, it's intent. Because optimization requires admitting that the way it has always been, it's not the same as the way it should be. So energy keeps flowing at night, not because people need it, but because systems don't know when to rest. And this is where the human factor becomes clear. We didn't design energy systems to match how humans actually live. We designed them to avoid interruption, to avoid complaints, to avoid responsibility, and to avoid the discomfort of fine tuning. So instead of asking when it's energy needed, we decided it should be available all the time. The result looks calm from space, but from inside the system, it's pure inefficiency, not dramatic and not catastrophic, just constant. And when you multiply that quiet waste across cities, countries, and continents, night after night, you start seeing a different picture. Not one of progress, but one of energy used without purpose. This isn't about turning the lights off. It's about finally asking why they are on the first place. There is one layer in energy systems that quietly shapes behavior, but it's almost never discussed directly: the moment of payment. Today, energy is experienced as something permanent. You switch it on and it works. A factory runs, a port operates, a city stays alive, and the cost appears later in invoices, reports, budgets, somewhere after the fact. And that delay matters. When payment always happens after consumption, energy stops feeling like a bounded resource. It becomes background infrastructure, like air, present, assumed, rarely questioned. That is where awareness disappears. Prepaid electricity doesn't change the system overnight, it changes attention. In the prepaid logic, consumption starts with intent, not because someone enforces limits, but because the user has to answer a simple question in advance: how much energy do I actually need for this cycle? That single shift alters behavior, especially for large consumers. Industrial users create the largest load on energy systems, yet they often feel the least friction from how the load is created. They pay for volume but not for shape, not for peaks and not for standby, not for the stress placed on grids that must remain ready for them at all times. The system absorbs that complexity silently. A prepaid structure introduces a different order. First comes forecasting, then commitment, consumption, and consequence. This is not a punishment, it is a feedback. When a company prepays for a defined energy envelope, it naturally starts examining things it previously ignored: idle consumption, standby losses, night cycles, unnecessary baseload, poor scheduling. Not because of ethics, but because of economics. And when consumption exceeds the prepaid envelope, the signal is immediate, not political, not abstract. A higher tariff, an additional cost, a visible penalty for inefficiency. The goal is not to shut down, the goal is awareness. What matters is that energy stops being an invisible background input and becomes a managed resource again. This logic already exists in other domains: mobile data, bandwidth, logistics capacity, even fuel cards. Prepaid systems don't eliminate use, they discipline it. For households, such model would be radical and politically sensitive. But for large industrial consumers, pilots are realistic, targeted, measurable, and reversible. And that is the key point. This is not about replacing collective systems. It is about testing selective layers where behavior matters most. Once energy is prepaid, even partially, consumption becomes a decision instead of a habit. Forecasting improves, waste becomes visible, overuse becomes expensive in real time, not years later through system degradation. And that is why prepaid electricity is not really about pricing. It's about restoring the link between use and consequence. When that link exists, systems don't need moral pressure. They self correct. At the end of all this, the problem isn't really energy. It's how casually we treat something that keeps everything alive. We have built a world where energy is always there, always ready, always flowing, and because of that, we stopped asking when it actually makes sense to use it. Not because people are careless, but because the system never asked them to care. When something is always available, it stops feeling finite. When it never pauses, it stops feeling valuable. And when responsibility is absorbed by infrastructure, behavior quietly disconnects from consequence. That's why this isn't a question of better technology, and it's not a question of the next transition. It's a question of discipline. Not discipline as control, discipline as awareness. The ability to tell the difference between use and habit, between necessity and convenience, between keeping life running and keeping everything switched on. If that distinction doesn't exist in how people think, no system will hold. It will always drift back to excess, because excess feels safe. Energy is life, but life doesn't mean constant motion. Sometimes it means knowing when to act, and sometimes it means knowing when not to. Until we learn that difference, we won't really be managing energy. We'll be just reacting to it. And reaction is the most expensive way to live.